Right, I think we'll get going. If you want to keep filtering in, feel free, but I'll get started. Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm Martin. I work for a startup in Oxford, but this is a talk mostly about one of my little side projects that I've been doing in the few weekends I can find to also do software things. It's relatively informal. I've got space for questions at the end, so if you've got anything big to ask, feel free to make a note of it and ask then. But if you need to interrupt, if I'm not clear on anything, feel free to do so. What we're covering, we'll do a quick introduction to versioning and version control, a very short history of version control systems, a talk about some of the problems with Git, and then I'll discuss why Breezy. So what is version control to start with? It's a record of changes across time. It often is a lot more than this, but that's the core concept. So in practice, you don't need to save a copy of everything each time you make a change to it. You simply save the changes, and it's often not just a single line of development, but a graph. So you can make two different changes to the same origin point, and then at some later point, bring them back together again. Why version control tool? It means you can make changes with confidence. I can edit my file, I can make some big complicated change to it. I know I can always get back to my previous state, and if I save what I'm doing along the route, if I go down the wrong path, I can always back up, go to a different place. It also means that it's much easier to have your changes in more than one place. So for instance, you will push them up to a remote server as well as having them on your laptop. That means that if somebody takes your laptop, you still have all of the changes you've been working on. It makes it much easier to collaborate with other people. So because you can have two different changes happening on the same original version at the same time, and then still be able to bring them back and merge them together again later on. You can have multiple different people working on the same point, even in the same area, on the same bit of the text, and you can know that you can always resolve that later on. This means that as soon as you're more than one person working on the project, it makes life much easier if you're using a system that helps you do that. And once you've gone to the effort of recording all of this stuff, so not just saving your final copy, but saving each step along the way, it gives you a fantastic record of when, who, and why changes have been made. And you can use that for basic things like, I need to know what I was doing last week, what was running on my server last week, but it also tells you there's this bug, I can now look through the history and see when this big bug was introduced and do things like actually have a retrospective on what happened, what you could do better next time. So the summary of this is you should use a version control system for all code you write. It just makes your life easier in the long run. You do a little bit of work up front, so you have to commit each step along the way. But then when you run into the hard problems, so something goes horribly wrong, it gives you a lot of really useful tools for dealing with those. So you spend a small amount of time up front, and you save a lot of time further down the line. A brief history of version control systems. So start off with local ones. So it's basically just a copy of the file, similar to the thing where I'm working on a file, I want to make a copy of it. I'm going to copy the original file and then work on the new copy of it. The original systems were similar to this, very slightly fancier, but they go back a long way. So there's SCCS in the 70s and RCS. Both of these are single file systems, so they only work on one file at a time. They were not actually very widely used. So for instance, Ken Thompson said about working on Unix, they didn't use a version control system of any time. That's a huge code base. They had a system where they could check code in, but you couldn't check code out again. So they could make backups, but they could never actually see what they'd done last week. So they were useful and interesting systems, but in practice they didn't get a lot of use. The next step along the route was centralized systems. So here you have all of your changes saved on a single server, and then you have a number of different clients which only have a particular checkout. So they've got a copy of a point in time, and they can talk back to the server to find out things about history or to make changes or to merge other changes. So CVS, which is built on RCS in the 90s, SVN, which is really a CVS with all the bad bits about CVS fixed. and a whole bunch of proprietary systems, so source safe, or perforce, things like this, all existed. A number of those have been worked on since, some of them have been ditched, but those basically work, but it doesn't help you with collaboration that much. Somebody has to physically run the server, and none of them are great at merging changes together again if two people have made changes in the same area. So the next step along the route was distributed systems, where everyone has the full copy of all of the changes that have been made. So Bitkeeper, Arch, Darks, all around the Millennium. Bitkeeper was used for the Linux kernel. It's a proprietary system, but has informed a lot of the work that's happened since then, in good and bad ways. And in reaction to those earlier systems, 2005, there were sort of three main version control systems that people were being encouraged to switch to from SVN and CVS. So Bazaar, Mercurial, and Git. They all sort of became usable about the same time. So what should you use? I've told you to version your code. What should you be using today? I've listed a lot of systems. You should use Git. It's what everyone else uses. It's much easier if you're using the same system everyone else uses, because it makes integrating changes simpler. It makes teaching other people, you're only teaching one set of rules the whole time. There are really good tools for it. There are a bunch of relatively free sites you can just push your code to. It is just the right thing to use currently. But Git is not perfect. Git has a number of problems with it. So it is famously quite hard to use. I could complain myself about various problems with Git, but here are a few examples from a blog post by Adrian Sampson, which is quite fun. So a mini quiz. How do you revert changes to a file in Git? You git revert, what do you do with it? No, you do git checkout head -- the file name you're trying to get your changes removed from. It's not very straightforward. How do you revert all of your changes? So I need to go back to what the branch is that I'm meant to be working on. Git reset hard. That's quite simple. The problem with this is also one of the best ways to destroy all of your work. So it's something you need to run quite a lot of the time, but if you run it in the wrong circumstance, you do lose work that you've been doing. How do you unadd a file? This is, we've got a thing in the tree, we want to take it out, but git rm cached file name. It's not super obvious. So lots of complaints, there are things to improve there. So another interesting thing that's happened recently is so much of the internals of Git are built on SHA-1. And there was, start of this year, an announcement from Google and some researchers in the Netherlands around a SHA-1 collision. What does this mean in practice? It means that hash functions generally work on, gives you one number out from the other end of your input, and it is not obvious to get back from that number, to reproduce that number from multiple different files. So hashing a different file should always give you a different final hash number. A hash collision means you've got two different files, so totally different content, that end up with the same hash. The reason this is bad is that it means I can pass off my bad file as your good file. And somebody who is looking at the hash to verify that it is the correct thing, which is what Git does internally a great deal, will then think that my bad file is your good file and use it instead. So the practicalities of this collision attack, so if you just try and brute force SHA-1, it takes an immense amount of computing power. With this somewhat practical attack, they did it with a lot of Google compute resources, so it's the sort of thing that a large company could now technically do. If they really wanted to produce two different files that had the same hash, they could do that. What do these semi-practical attacks mean for Git? There's a LWN article you can read on this if you want. It sort of is not as bad news as it seems at the moment, because of the way the hashing works internally in Git. You're generally treating hashes of hashes. It's a chained hash, so each commit object hashes all of its parent commit objects, hashes its parent, so implicitly you have a chain down through the hashes. So at best you can probably try and flip in a blob from somebody else without them realizing, but then you're talking about it's the person who's controlling the place you're checking the code out from. So it's a concern, but it's not the biggest deal at the moment. You shouldn't be panicking about this. The other thing is VCSs should just do a lot more than they do at the moment. They're really useful. We use them for a bunch of things. They're particularly great for software engineering. But they don't handle large or unmergeable files very well. Git has specific support for big files via a sort of semi-built-in extension, and there are a number of tools built on top of Git that handle large files, but none of it's built into the tool. If you're doing things like, I'm generating a large data set from my code, I want to save this data set because I'm propagating it to other people. So for instance, machine learning models, training data, this kind of stuff. That's really awkward to do at the moment. Computer game companies often have art assets, other things that would make sense to store in a single repository. At the moment, they tend to use multiple different repositories because the needs of their art department and the needs of their programmers are just so different. We should work better with non-software engineering tasks. So I was talking to a friend of mine who works in pharma the other day, and she said, actually, we probably should use version control for a lot of our stuff, but at the moment we just have a really careful naming scheme for all of our files. So the thing is, a lot of this is not very easy to use. It doesn't work great with non-text files. It generally just falls down as soon as you're trying to do something that's not software development with version control. We also should do better at collaboration. We do a bunch, and there's a lot that is supplied by the sort of site you use. So the GitHubs do a lot of work around making collaboration easier, but the core tool is kind of hard to use. If I'm trying to check out changes from somebody else, make some changes, then send them those changes back again, the sort of Git kernel model is still, I email you a patch. That's kind of the best answer we have on that front. So there's a bunch that we could do to make collaboration better. One of the things Debian's looked at a fair bit is distributed bug tracking using version control, and they've had several stabs at it and not really got anywhere very far. But that's the kind of thing that would also be useful. If I can submit a bug that is tied into the version control system, or at least linked to it with it, that makes it much easier for people to just report things and me to get feedback without needing a single place that people have to have a login for and go and find. And what else? I'm sure you guys have some ideas about what works and what doesn't work with how you do things today. There are lots of interesting ideas that could be pursued, lots of things that are worth trying out and seeing if they work. Not everything has to succeed, but there's a bunch of things that versioning can help solve and make your life easier. And it would be nice to spread that around and get it to more people. So, introducing Breezy. This is a fork of the Bazaar version control system that I discussed with Jelmer at the last FOSDEM in February, and we decided we're going to go ahead and do this, so pick up the Bazaar codebase, which has been languishing for a while, try and make it modern and workable for people and easy to hack on. So we have a website, we've done a bunch of work over the summer. It is implemented entirely in Python with a few bits of Python and a couple of C extension modules that you don't need to care very much about. It's very accessible code. All of the pieces make some amount of logical sense. We have a fantastic test suite that covers literally everything, I think. So you can make a change to it, see if a test fails. You can add new formats, change formats around, and I will review your code. I will look at your code. It will get landed. It has native Git support using Dulwich, which is basically a Python implementation of Git. There's still some amount of work to do on making the foreign format, so particularly Git, work nice and natively with the client. But it basically works for the common task you want it to and can be improved. It has a different but generally nicer command line. This isn't necessarily helpful to you if you're already in the world of Git, because by and large, switching between two different ways of doing things is more confusing than using one bad way of doing it. However, if you're introducing something to Git to a new person, trying to get somebody else to start versioning their code and they haven't done anything before, it's worth looking at Bazaar or one of these GUI systems instead of launching them straight into the Git command line. There is a Python 3 port in progress. I am working on it. I've said back at FOSDEM that it would take me a week. That I've probably spent about a week's worth of time on it, and I've done the first 80% and I've sort of got the second 80% to go. But it's getting there. The test suite all runs, so we have a list of test failures, so things that are obviously broken and need fixing in Python 3. I have a bunch of interesting experience of what works and what doesn't in porting Python 2 to Python 3 code. So if you're interested in that independently, come and find me in a hallway and talk to me. I can give you lots of interesting experiences on that front. We have a very flexible plugin framework. So if you want to just write one little tool that, for instance, looks over all of your history and then finds commits that look like a particular thing, or finds commits by a particular person, all of this stuff is sort of easy to implement in relatively few lines of code. As this has been while the code loads light so far, here's a plugin example. This is the top level thing. Basically, you just register the commands that you're going to use. All of this is done via lazy registration because Python imports are slow. There's been an interesting thread on Python Dev about that recently. But it's mostly straightforward. You just register your code and then you implement a command like this. So you subclass the commands command, you have args defined as a class argument, and then you have a run function that takes the argument you expect and then creates a working tree or does whatever else you need to do on the actual code at the end. It's currently available in Debian testing if you want to just install it. We also have the code up on Launchpad, which is the old canonical tracking site. It's where Bazaar does all of its bug tracking, so it's nice. We could import all of the bugs really easily, basically. It's hosted using the current Bazaar 2.0 format. We will at some point do a format switch of the repository, but that's the sort of thing that nobody should actually have to care about. People shouldn't really care about what format their code is saved in. We are currently using the Bazaar mailing list to communicate with people. I've done a few sort of mini sprints, so if anyone wants to get involved and find anything out about that, that would be fantastic. And I've left even more time for questions than I thought I had. So I hope there's some questions, and I'll go into more details if anyone else has anything. And I'll encourage somebody to stick a hand up. Yep.
Are you sprinting on Monday or this?
So I would have loved to sprint on Monday, but I couldn't. Me and Jan both have full-time software jobs, so I couldn't get both of us in one place at once. At the moment, we've done Oxford and we've done London, because I'm in Oxford and he's in London. But it would be pretty easy to organise something if people are keen to hack on things. Also, I am around over the next 4 days. I would love people to come up and talk to me about version control of any sort, and I will help people out getting started if they're interested. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. So the question is, if nobody's using Bazaar before, why would you start using Breezy instead of using Git? So my main argument here is that if you want to make a change to the version control system itself, it's actually really hard to make a change to Git, get it landed and get it used. It's also really hard to extend Git in any way. You can build on top of Git quite easily. So a whole bunch of people have built stuff basically on the Git underlying format, because the Git format is really quite simple and is quite reusable. But it doesn't do a lot of things that you could do with version control. So my argument is that if you want to do something interesting with version control, it makes sense to build it on a nice hackable Python system instead of a rather large complicated project like Git.
Why would you then not do it on Mercurial?
So this is, I think if you want to work on Mercurial, you should absolutely work on Mercurial instead. I think Mercurial is in a similar position to Bazaar now in that it's used a little bit, but not that much. There's sort of no reason to use Mercurial instead of Git. But it's, by all means, hack on Mercurial if you want.
Is there
Yep.
Git to tackle the kind of unintuitive, more likely space about using large files like non-text files?
So the question is there any movement within Git to tackle some of the problems I've talked about? So certainly around large files and stuff, there has been a lot of interest over the years, which has sort of not got very far. So the original large file support did land, but it's one of these things where the core people who care about Git don't care about the other people's problems, and they by and large make it work for them. It's also stuff like, it's really hard to make changes to a command line, because if somebody changed the command line for Git and I updated my Git version and the command I was previously changing now does something completely different, I would be super annoyed. So making those sorts of breaking changes with an existing user base is really hard. Whereas if you've got a slightly more intuitive system to start with, or if the way this generally works with Git is people say, the command line's just hard, you shouldn't be using the command line, use this nice GUI thing. But the problem is then people are stuck in the GUI and they can't get down and do all the interesting things that are actually great. Git rebase -I is fantastic. The problem is most people are terrified of it for a pretty good reason, in that it can do some really scary things. But that means we're not giving a lot of the power to the people we're saying you should use version control. We're saying you should do all this work up front, make sure you commit your changes on a regular basis, and we're not actually going to show you how this makes your life easier. We're just going to make you do the initial work and then not save your time later, because you still have to destroy your Git repository and check it out if something goes wrong.
So I'm not quite clear. I think you're saying that Breezy at the moment is basically par with Bazaar.
Yeah.
Ported, you use
Yeah.
and tied it up.
Yeah.
You do anything that Bazaar didn't do in the first place. Am I right?
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, Bazaar, it is mostly parity with Bazaar with some better foreign version support, because that's what we've been working on, and Python 3 support. So those are our two sort of initial release goals for it, is a more modern code base and yeah, foreign version support. Russell?
Do you find it ironic that all the distributed version control systems are actually being used as centralized?
Do I find it ironic that yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Is fully distributed, the distributed wiki,
Yeah.
distributed bug tracker, and has actually no central point of failure.
Yeah. So the question is it ironic that we're talking about all these distributed version control systems and basically everyone uses it in a centralized fashion? So I push my code to GitHub. GitHub is the server. It doesn't matter that it's decentralized, because everything's on GitHub and GitHub own it. Yes, and I think that is bad. I would much prefer if we properly had a distributed model where we weren't reliant on one company. The problem is they provide a service that works for a bunch of people because it does things that the core Git does not do. They have a nice model where I can actually do a pull request and get it merged, which with Git it means finding a mailing list, sending a patch. So doing that in a fully distributed manner is hard, and it's a problem that hasn't been worked on properly.
With all hashing algorithms eventually will be cracked,
Yep.
can Git and your software upgrade to a more harder to crack algorithm easily?
Yep. So one of the questions is, we know that hash algorithms tend to get broken. So can Git change format support? Can Breezy change format support? Git has only had one format in its lifetime. It was essentially written bottom up. So Linux started with the this is the model for how things are saved, and then built all the porcelain, so all the commands and stuff on top of that. That means it doesn't really have any support for changing formats underneath it. There is current discussion about changing the hash format and updating it, but there's no mechanism for doing this. How would you change all of your repositories on GitHub to a new Git format? Nobody's even thought about attempting that. Bazaar, the one good thing about the fact it had lots of formats is it has really good support for changing between formats. So ideally, it would not have gone through like 5 different revisions of tree format. In practice, it did, but that means that format support is really easy and breezy, because there's UI for it, it's fully supported in the code, it's well tested, it all works.
Do you have any thoughts for version control systems for other professions? I'm thinking of like lawyers and Word
Yeah.
script writers or medical records.
Yeah, so version control for other systems, particularly lawyers, medical people who often work in Word. This is one of the things I would love to get solved. I think it's the sort of thing you could make a company that made money doing this for people, actually getting them onto a system that works. There are legal professional things that do this, but as far as I'm aware, most people who live their life in Word documents do things like, I'm going to color all of my changes in yellow, Bob's going to color all of his changes in red, Lisa's going to color all her changes in blue, and then somebody's responsible for sorting out the mess at the end of it. This is the sort of thing I think we should be tackling with version control and looking to not just serve ourselves with it, but actually serve the wider community as well.
Okay, we have to finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.